Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the FBO SafetyNet webinar series. Today's session is presented by Madeline Sullivan of Polaris Aero, discussing human performance and systems safety. I'm Catherine Hilst. I am the FBO Operations Manager, and as the globally recognized voluntary safety standard, FBO helps operators apply industry best practices by challenging them to review and compare their safety-related policies, processes, and procedures, and then make improvements, elevating them to the worldwide standard for business aviation. We love these SafetyNet presentations by Polaris Aero, and this goes right to the heart of how we all interface with our safety management systems and system safety. There's a few housekeeping items before we get rolling here today. Everyone is on mute, and you'll stay on mute during the presentation. However, in your control panel, you will have a questions box. Please type in your questions just as they come up during the presentation, and we will look at those when Madeline has finished the presentation. I'm so excited to have Polaris Aero back. Our industry, business, and charter aviation is fraught with unpredictability, yet it's common for managers and leaders to become trapped by an illusion of control over their operations. By understanding how and why people make decisions or behave in certain ways within complex systems, we can face the challenges of the innately unstable conditions in our operations, avoid the illusion of control trap, and be better equipped to build the resilience of our operations. This webinar will dive into the relevance of considering human performance when designing, implementing, and executing system safety within your organization. Madeline is the product manager for Polaris Aero and is responsible for developing the VOCUS product roadmap and ensuring the roadmap is aligned with customer needs, regulatory requirements, and the Polaris Aero vision. Prior to joining Polaris, Madeline was both a safety and compliance specialist for a large Part 135 operator and ran several related programs, including ASAP for pilots and maintenance. She has experience working in privately owned FBOs in the U.S. Senate and for a State Department of Aeronautics. Madeline holds a Bachelor of Science in Air Transport Administration and recently earned her Master of Engineering in Advanced Safety Engineering and Management. She's also a recreational pilot. Madeline, I'm so happy to have you back again, and I'm very excited for your presentation today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be back and kicking off our fall SafetyNet webinar series. This will be a three-part series per usual. We have another one coming up at the end of October, and then in November as well. So those dates will be on the IBAC website as well as on social media and LinkedIn as well. So keep an eye out for those upcoming webinars. So as Catherine introduced the topic here on human performance and system safety, we're going to spend some time really just providing a good overview of what we're really talking about when we're talking about human performance. And we're going to tie that into systems safety. And the reason that that's important is because that's really our approach, our systematic approach to managing safety of our complex industry. So we'll get into all of these topics. I want to start actually by introducing, I guess, just a quick question here to the crowd. And you're welcome to put this in the chat. I can monitor that, but really I just want you to think about this question. What words or phrases would you use to describe how people perceive your safety role, or just safety roles in general in your organization? Just, I guess, to help jumpstart things here a little bit, some people I've asked this to in the past have used terms like a risk manager or the safety police or a rule enforcer, a data analyst, right? So think of a word or phrase or maybe a few, put them in the chat or just jot them down, but I want you to remember them because I'm going to come back to this question at the very end of the presentation. So again, what words or phrases would you use to describe how people perceive your safety role, including how you perceive your own safety role? That is, if you are in a safety position. Okay, hopefully you've thought of a couple words, so I'm gonna move on. Continue to jot them down if you come up with them over the course of the presentation here. As always, I like to start with a couple of definitions, who doesn't, and that's really just to get these out of the way, but also just to set the baseline understanding of what these terms really mean. So the first term here is system safety, and what we're really talking about is an approach which requires one to view the relationship and interactions within a system holistically and over time. Now, a system, when we're talking about a system, I'm using that term very generically, and it references a lot of different things. So I'm talking about our system of operating our aircraft. I'm talking about our system of our industry in general. Really, any situation where you have things and people interacting is what we're considering a system, right? So in other words, in order to create safety or design safety or harness safety in our respective organizations or our respective systems, we must truly understand what those systems are made of, right? You can't change something or do something in a system if you don't understand how it functions and why it functions in the way that it does. What are the dynamics that are at play in a system? What are all of the different parts of your organization that you need to be aware of? So think about the different types of people involved. Think about all of the equipment, the locations, the procedures. Those are a huge part of our systems, right? Even just the culture, that's a huge element as well. What are the roles of your workers? What are your expectations of them? How are they different from one to another? And how do all of those things interact together? What ways are they predictable? And in what ways are they not predictable or unpredictable? So for example, we might be able to clearly identify all of the actions that a mechanic might take on an aircraft because the parts of an aircraft are finite. We know every single part, or theoretically, we know every single part of an aircraft. So we therefore know how we can interact with that aircraft. However, when you put, for example, a pilot in the cockpit of an aircraft, the dynamics start to change, right? All of the things that a pilot can do at any given time are so vast. There are so many decisions that can be made. There are so many different things that can happen or reasons for doing things that the dynamics are much more different in how the pilot interacts with that aircraft versus how a mechanic interacts with an aircraft. So that's just one example or one way that we can think about how system safety is truly affected by these interactions, interdependencies, and the unpredictability of all of the components of that system. So let's move on to human performance. Now, this definition that you see on the screen here, I'll read it in a moment. This is a definition that I put together actually through my graduate studies, and it really consolidates a lot of different theories or thoughts around human performance. And so that definition is that human performance is the way in which a person conducts their work and contributes to the system as a result of their intentions, their perceptions, their observations, their constraints, and all of the collected influences upon them, known or unknown. Okay, so that's a mouthful, so let's break it down a little bit. The type of human performance that we care about in this conversation specifically is related to the workplace. So we're looking at not only the way a person does their work, so how they go about completing their tasks, but also the way that they contribute to the overall system. So think about something like engaging in conversation or submitting voluntary reports or participating in roundtable discussions, helping another team member or colleague learn and do their job better or make sense of their situation, right? Contributing to the overall system is a huge component of our human performance in general. So we're not just talking about completing our daily activities, but how we complete our daily activities and how we interact with the entire system as a whole. Now, conducting work and contributing to the system don't just happen. Well, to an untrained person, they might just happen, but really what we're talking about is a result of every single influence on an individual, whether we know what those influences are or not. So if we can't name an influence, does that mean it doesn't exist? Absolutely not, right? It's like saying, if a tree falls in the forest, does it really make a sound? Of course it makes a sound, right? So just because we might not be able to put a name to an influence or to be able to predict it or clearly identify it, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So our priority here is to be aware of the fact that there are influences involved, and we can't make assumptions that that is not true. So influences can be vastly categorized. We're not going to get deep into those different types of categories, but we do have to consider these things that I've laid out here, right? So what are a person's intentions in how they go about completing their work and performing in their environment? What are their perceptions of any situation at any given time in how that affects how they complete their work and interact with their system? What are their observations of the system as a whole? And what are their constraints? What are their limitations? What affects their perceptions, their observations, and their intentions? So all of these influences affect the way that a person behaves and determines why they're doing a task or performing their job in the way that they are. And we're not just talking about educational influences per se. I think oftentimes that's where our minds can go, right? So when was the last time we were at sim training, or we sat through ground training of an aircraft system, right? Those, or took an advanced mathematics or fuel conservation course or something of that nature, right? Of course, those things are going to influence our knowledge. That's obviously a given, but we have to consider influences beyond education. And that's really what I'm trying to emphasize here. So, for example, what are our perceptions of the way that someone went about doing their work, and how does that affect my ability to do my work? Those are the types of questions that we need to be asking. What are the constraints that those people are under? Why did it make sense for that individual to perform that action in the way that they did at the time that they did it? So human performance is more than just the behavior of a person. It gives us the ability to recognize that people perform their work and contribute to the system in ways that make sense to them, based on all of these things that are completely different from one person to another. So your limitations, intentions, perceptions, observations are going to be different from every other person that might be put in the exact situation that you might be in, or that your employee might be in, right? So those variances are very important, and we'll get to that in just a moment. All right, so not sure if we have any math gurus in the room here, but this is a very interesting equation that I like to bring up. Obviously, it's not a traditional math equation. It was developed by a man named Tim Autry, who came up with an equation to explain and to help us remember the meaning of human performance. Now, obviously, HP in this equation stands for human performance. The W stands for the Y. The R stands for results, meaning the results of someone's performance. The B stands for behavior, meaning the manner in which someone conducts their performance. So what this equation is really telling us is that human performance is equal to why people do what they do in the way that they, and why they do it. So HP equals W times R plus B. Human performance is why people do what they do the way that they do it. And this has to do with a lot of things, right? It has to do with the influences, the constraints, what we know about the system in general. So keep this equation in mind, why people do what they do in the way that they do it. We're going to touch back on this in just a moment. But to give an example, I'm going to assume everyone pretty much knows what this sign means, particularly if you're in the United States, right? This is a merge sign. And the example I want to use is driving to work. And so I'm going to set the scene here, and let's say that every day when you drive to work, there's a point in your route where you have to merge because your lane is ending. And let's say that pretty reliably you follow the rules. So the rules of merging, that is. So you match your speed with the traffic that you're merging into, you space yourself accordingly, and you check your blind spot to make sure no one's in your blind spot before you actually conduct that merge, right? Now let's say that one day you complete that merge, and after the fact, you realize that you didn't follow those rules that you typically follow. Maybe you didn't actually check your blind spot. Excuse me. That may simply have been an error. You know that if you had the presence of mind in that moment, that you would have checked your blind spot, but you just didn't for whatever reason. This type of error is very difficult to explain and difficult to control because we can't anticipate it. We know that we routinely check our blind spot, but for some reason on that day we didn't. And if we had known that we weren't going to do it, we maybe could have put a process in place to protect ourselves from that and checked our blind spot. But alas, that wasn't the case. So we know what our intent is, but our circumstance resulted in something unforeseeable. Now, let's say on a different day, excuse me, that you intentionally didn't check your blind spot because you felt you had absolute confidence that nobody was in the lane that you were merging into. Maybe you could see the traffic from the on-ramp, or maybe cars around you weren't slowing down to indicate that there was traffic, right? So whatever the case may be, you made a quick decision at that point in time to essentially save yourself a little bit of effort, no matter how small. And that effort would have been, to comply with the rules. This would be classified as a mistake or a deviation. It doesn't really matter what you call it, but the fact of the matter is that our circumstances led to a decision that made sense to us at that time, that allowed us to navigate around the rules. If you don't perceive risk, you're more inclined to take a shortcut. Excuse me. So what is missing from this story? And what's missing is a bad outcome. Now, in this example, excuse me, I'm recovering from COVID, everyone, so I have a tickle in my throat. So in this example, I never suggested that someone was actually in your blind spot. And I did that intentionally because if we let outcomes drive our decision making and our behaviors, then we reduce our capacity to learn from the system. So if I had told you that in any of those scenarios that there was someone in your blind spot and that you had caused an accident, well, now we're going to perceive our situation differently. We're going to potentially assign blame to an individual for navigating around the rules. But the fact of the matter is that those two situations were very different. In one situation, our intentions were good. In the other situation, our intentions were also good, but they were predicated on our perception of our environment, that there was a lack of risk or a lack of a threat. So merging mistakes or merging errors happen far more frequently than merging mistakes or errors that result in a car accident or a bad outcome. So the point is, the outcome really isn't interesting to us at all. It's more so a matter of unpredictable happenstance, right? So if we think back to our human performance definition or that equation, we can begin to understand that our system, we can understand our system better by asking why a person did what they did. So why did they merge in the way that they did without looking? In one circumstance, it was because of something unforeseeable, and in another circumstance, it was because of a lack of perceived risk. Two completely different reasons for the same action. Some situations are purely preventable and others aren't. So I like to put this slide in here because it gives me a chance to address rules and regulations, because they're absolutely necessary. There's no doubt about that. However, they don't work 100% of the time for every single scenario. If you think about every time we take action or we complete work, a critical action in our work, it's not feasible to regulate them completely. So I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I want to suggest that breaking the rules or deviating or navigating outside of what a regulation or what a standard suggests isn't necessarily always a bad thing. What matters is the reasoning behind it and the circumstances that allowed for it. Not because it gives us something to learn from so that we won't do it again, but because it can show us a new way, a potentially even safer way of completing a task in a way that the previously defined SOPs or regulations didn't consider. Now, obviously, we'll want to take this with a grain of salt because every safety culture within every organization is different, right? The dynamics are different and they're very important to consider. So for example, if your culture doesn't support trust or doesn't have a strong culture where you can afford to allow for these types of deviances, then a different approach may certainly be warranted, right? Anyways, when a deviation does occur, or someone does something unexpected, or they do break an SOP or deviate from what the SOP was intended to do, it would be prudent for us to ask, why did it make sense for them to do what they did in the way that they did it? Because that's going to allow us to understand context. And context is very important here because it can become very easy for us to try to keep things black and white because that's very straightforward to us, right? The rule says this and you did this, and therefore those are not one and the same. A deviation occurred and action needs to be taken in light of that. However, the reasoning and the context behind decision making is really critical because it gives us insights into how we can improve our system and make it better. It gives us insights into what our SOPs or regulations don't account for, and it allows us to see how we can make changes or where changes can be made or implemented in order to create the sense of resiliency in the organization, to give our employees the confidence to act based on their situation without fear that they're going to be breaking a rule or deviating in a way that's going to reflect negatively on themselves. So again, rules are absolutely important, but our system doesn't lend itself to being 100% managed by rules completely. We need something else. We need this latitude, or we need to afford a sense of margin or account for improvisation, adaptation, or an appreciation of our craft, which is our ability to complete our work in the way that we've learned over time. So that brings us to this conversation of complexity. And I want to break this down a little bit. If you've seen a presentation by me before with IVAC, you'll have seen some information similar to this, and I'll keep this pretty concise. But I want to talk about different types of systems to really emphasize why this is important. When we're talking about a simple system, we're talking about something like a watch or a piece of luggage or a simple tool. We're talking about a system where when something breaks in that system, there is only one reason for why that thing breaks, right? It is easily traceable. The relationship between cause and effect is linear, it's direct, it's singular, and it is very well managed by manuals, how-to guides, procedures, things of that nature, because all of those interactions are very clearly defined and available to us, and we can understand very easily when something breaks, how to fix it. So a watch is an excellent example of this. A complicated system is one that I've already mentioned before, which is an aircraft, and this is a system where you have many different parts, not an innumerable amount of parts. You have a lot. You know, I wouldn't give a figure to that, but the point is that you know every single part that's on that aircraft. It's all accounted for, and you can understand all of the interactions of them. However, they're very diverse. So they're predictable, but they're very, it requires much more information, much more analysis to understand these interactions. Manuals and checklists are still an excellent method for navigating these types of systems, right? Because we can identify all of these interactions, and because we can identify them, we can predict them to a certain extent, and we can put procedures and documentation in place for what to do under any of these circumstances. Now, like I said, it might be very complicated to do or to figure out or to manage, but nonetheless, a resolve will be possible. The final system, which is the one that we talk about here, is the complex system. And this is, again, what we're going to be focusing on, because all of the parts of the system, humans, technology, equipment, procedures, policies, all of these different components work together, but to a certain extent are unpredictable. The amount of relationships and interactions are too vast to identify all of them or to even categorize all of them, right? What is true about complexity and complex systems is that failure is unpredictable. If we could predict it, like we can in diagnosing an aircraft or diagnosing an issue with a watch, right? Things would be a lot simpler. We would have all of the rules and procedures and checklists in place that could account for every single interaction. But in complex systems, that's not possible. We can only account for those interactions to a certain extent. But where we start to introduce unpredictability, that has to do with things like human adaptation and variability. So, for example, let's put one pilot in an aircraft flying from point A to point B under certain conditions. The way that they conduct their work and navigate from point A to B may be similar, but still different from if you were to put a different pilot in that same position. So the way that we interact with our environments as people is completely different from one person to the next. Now, of course, you have procedures and routine built in there where a lot of things are the same, but if you're faced with an unpredictable situation, let's say you have a master caution light come up or you have weather pop up, you know, the way that we process this information is always going to be different to a certain extent, right? So, or to an unpredictable extent. So we have to account for the nature of humans, of that we are so different from one another. That is what creates this variability and unpredictability in complex systems. It's multi-dimensional, and it's this fluid approach that acknowledges this and respects unpredictability and accounts for human performance where adaptivity lies. So we'll get more into adaptivity in just a moment, but really I just wanted to set the stage here for understanding why it is that we care so much about human performance. And it is because we are the singular reason why complex systems exist, because we can't predict how they're going to interact with each other. So a healthy respect for human performance then looks at, or it looks like a willingness to engage in deep inquiry, to engage in sense making, to engage in learning, to engage in creating this environment of psychological safety that's so critical for navigating complexity. So by deep inquiry, I'm talking about deeply questioning our behaviors and why we're doing things. When we talk about sense making, I'm talking about not just navigating a situation with just your own information, but opening up conversation to other people and their perspectives, and to taking in all of that information and trying to make sense of it in order to better understand any given situation. When we talk about learning in an environment of psychological safety, we're talking about creating this culture of trust where we feel psychologically safe to engage in challenging conversations that might put our own ego on the line, or it might put our own perceptions up for criticism. And we need to be willing to suspend our own judgments of other people and suspend our own concern of ourselves and our thoughts in order to kind of achieve this greater goal of resiliency at the end of the day. So this then allows us to interact with our system in a way that we can build margin, and we can use discretion to then make decisions in any given situation that might be beyond what an SOP or regulation can provide us. So hearing and agreeing with all this hopefully isn't too difficult, but it's putting it into practice that's challenging, because we are naturally predisposed to different ways of thinking about our environment. We like to correlate causation, right? So if you think about from infancy how we're taught right from wrong, we're taught that, you know, if you don't tie your shoe, you'll trip and fall. But what we're not taught is that you may fall because you didn't tie your shoe, or because maybe you're clumsy, or there was a curb in the way, or some other reason, right? So there's a different approach that we can take to our conversations that will allow us to kind of broaden our understanding of what's happening in our environment and be better able to make sense of that. So cause and effect relationships are important. They're very important for simple and complex, complicated systems. They are still important in complicated and complex systems, such as the aviation industry as a whole and each of our own operating environments. And they're really useful because we can design great rules and regulations for the behaviors that we can predict. But when we introduce that human element, things become so complex that we need to give ourselves this latitude that I've been talking about. So, in other words, we need to acknowledge that complexity exists, and we need to acknowledge complexity in order to understand causality. I want to bring up a very quick quote from ICAO here, and this quote says that examining systems through this view of complexity is necessary to make sense of the interactions and interconnections of its components or parts, which are predictable or knowable, and to recognize the extent to which the interfacing of these components and parts are unpredictable and unknowable. So really this quote is just here to emphasize that we first want to understand the extent to which things are unpredictable in our system or operations. And we have to first agree that they can be unpredictable as a fact. So once we can agree on that, then we can move forward. It's really hard for us to do that because we're trained and we're predisposed to reach for control, to maintain control, to have control, to exhibit control of our systems. And we do that in many different ways. One example of that is the metrics that we use, right? So does a decrease in deviation reports really mean that we've gained control over our system? How about when you consider a decrease in overall reporting or overall flying, when you look at the decrease in correlation to the decrease in deviation reports, right? So even still, just because deviations aren't necessarily coming to fruition or we're not being made aware of them doesn't mean that the elements which could lead to them don't exist. I'm not trying to discourage any of you or allude to the fact or that your efforts are fruitless, because they're absolutely not. But what I want to communicate is that nothing is always as it seems, and there's always more to know, and that when we rely on certain metrics and we rely on our rules and procedures to navigate our system completely, then we start to accept and come under this illusion of control. So this illusion of control is really significant because it creates blindness within our system, where context and influences of any given situation may not be considered when making decisions or taking action. So the fact is, we can't claim control of our system completely, despite our robustness of our own rules and SOPs, or our historical data, or things like that, or even our good safety record, right? When we do that, we start to become complacent and we become blind to indications that our system is actually telling us. So illusion is problematic. Equally problematic is our desire to have control. When we have that desire, again, we fall into this trap of believing in a system that can be 100% stable. And when we start to believe in that, we start to reduce our propensity to understand or to perceive risk. We start to accept risk far more than we start to challenge it. And when we have a stable system and become complacent in this way, we put more stock into our cultural norms and drift more towards danger. Whereas if we acknowledge instability triggered by unpredictability of our complex system, we maintain this level of awareness, vigilance, sensitivity. We stay on our toes. This is something that's going to come up later. So for example, we know risk acceptance is necessary in our industry, but in addition to talking about what level of risk we can and should accept, we also need to be having a conversation about the amount of margin that we have to navigate, to accept risk or not, but that margin needs to include these inputs of human performance, essentially. So I just want to bring this up here because it's interesting, at least for me, and hopefully you feel the same. But what we're looking at here is the headline, and the headline here is SFO plane crash, who was at fault? If we fail, if we do end up failing or failing in some sort of catastrophic way, we end up with something like this in the media. Now, obviously, one issue is that certain narratives can be perpetuated without validation or legitimacy. Obviously, I think most of us would have an issue with this headline in general, but it's representative of something bigger. It's representative of our predisposition to traditional and simple cause and effect relationships. We are much more complex than what this headline is alluding to. We are more sophisticated than that, and we need a different mentality to call attention to and challenge these sorts of cultural norms that are often just generally accepted in our environments. I find this quote to be really useful because it does emphasize why we should pay attention to our overall reliance on regulations and controls. It says that complex and safety critical organizations' emphasis on order and control and reliance on routine to reduce the probability of error could suppress creativity and innovation when faced with an unexpected situation. So we need order and routine. We need control of our systems to the extent that it can be controlled in terms of how it functions and things like that, but it will never be 100% controllable like we talked about. So if we ignore that fact, if we persist on relying on routine to reduce probability of error, we're doing ourselves a disservice. We're not making room for the unexpected. We need to be able to recognize when our normal procedures and processes won't fit a scenario and be comfortable with navigating within the certain level of margin to meet the demands of that scenario. We'll talk about goal, conflict, and trade-offs here in just a minute. But really what we're talking about is strengthening our right hemisphere of our brain, this creative muscle in our brain, which controls our ability to utilize our craft beyond an analytical sense. It's really what we're talking about, a balance of compliance and craft, or of creativity and independence. Both are necessary, both work together, any situation is going to require a balance of both, and we need them to exist. But again, it's a balance, but there is room for craft and creativity in how we navigate our situations, because that's what's going to help us navigate unpredictability. Now, I want to shift the conversation to human performance here, and this is where I'm going to spend the majority of the rest of our time. And to do that, I want to turn to ICAO, because they recently, in the last few years, put out a manual on human performance for regulators. And it's on your screen here. It's Doc 10151, the Manual on Human Performance for Regulators. And it also was coupled with a great section in on their website. So if you just even Google or search ICAO human performance, one of the first hits that you'll see will take you to their human performance landing page. And there are many different areas on that page that you can navigate to get information, a lot of which we're going to be talking about here. It also will navigate you to this actual document itself. Now, obviously, as in the title, it says that this is meant for regulators, but it can be extrapolated for the commercial and civilian audience. And so obviously that's how I'm going to apply it in today's conversation. The manual has a few minor errors. I'm not going to touch on this today, but it is the best representation so far that I've found of how human performance should be understood and how it can be addressed in simple ways in our industry and in our complex systems. They outline 5 key principles for human performance, and those are what I'm going to dive in deeper on today. Now, I do want to mention that this document is fairly long. A lot of it is very regulatory centric, a big portion in the middle there, but just navigate through the table of contents if you choose, and you'll be able to get some excellent information on our topic. Again, I'm going to condense some of it here for you. So, human performance principle number 1. People's performance is shaped by their capabilities and limitations. Think of these as the physiological, the psychological, the cognitive, and the sensory limitations and capabilities of people. Everything from how much sleep we get and how well we sleep, to how good our memory is, to how well we can handle stress, and everything in between. These are the types of things that we're talking about with capabilities and limitations here. It's pretty likely that you and your department already have considered things like fatigue risk management to a certain extent in your operations, which is excellent. That shows that you're considering this first principle in light of fatigue. Under normal working conditions, we intend for everyone to be well rested, well fed, physically fit, mentally fit to conduct their work, to go about their day. However, when the pressure is on, how quickly do these seemingly critical components fall to the wayside? How quickly might we be willing to ask a crew member to go without their lunch or get less sleep? There's no right or wrong to that equation, but the fact of the matter is that the way that people perform are shaped by their capabilities and limitations. And so when you start to affect their capabilities and limitations because of the constraints of the work environment, because of the demands of the work environment, you're naturally going to affect their performance. So it's just something to be aware of. Cognition is also very important here, because it's very natural to try to, or to want to, reduce our cognitive load. And we do that very frequently by automation. So how can we automate our responses so that we don't have to think about them? Think back to my example of merging on the highway, and how often we drive on the road, rules of the road, and we automate some of these tasks like turning on our turn signal, right? We can translate that example to something in an aircraft or for a maintenance technician. Automation can help us be more efficient in how we do our work most of the time. And most of the time it works really well. But in cases where it doesn't work, our decision making or our capacity for decision making becomes reduced because our actions are so routine that they happen more quickly than our ability to make a decision. And because of how these heuristics are really developed over time. So one example of this, a practical example of this is, let's say you operate one type of aircraft for 20 years, and then you change jobs and you're moving to a different fleet completely. And you're put in a situation where you need, to make a decision very quickly or act very quickly. And your action might be predicated on that 20 years of history flying a completely different aircraft, right? So, that puts us into a whole discussion of how many aircraft should you be qualified to fly, how much difference is training, or how important differences training really is in operating aircraft. It also shows us how that person's capacity to make decisions in that aircraft while they have 20 years of experience might be different than the co-pilot sitting next door to them that has only ever flown the type of aircraft that they're currently flying, right? So just an example to get you thinking there. Sensory limitations are also interesting. This has to do with our ability to perceive things or to notice things in our environment. We're not talking about situational awareness per se, but rather what aren't you aware of and why? When we become task focused, naturally we can lose a sense of where an indicator is at, or what the illumination panel is telling us in the cockpit, or where our bolts are that we put down from working on an aircraft, right? It's incredible how many master caution light stories I've heard of where the master caution light was illuminated and it wasn't noticed until someone was actually lined up on the taxi or lined up on the runway ready to depart, right? And task saturation, sensory limitations have an important part in this, and cockpit design is a huge area where we consider sensory limitations. A particular quote that resonates for me from ICAO based on this is, "For all of their limitations, when well supported, people are able to manage novel situations, adapting their skills to safely manage the operation. It is the human trait of adaptivity that enables the global aviation system to function." You can find that quote in the Human Performance Manual. Let's move on to the second principle. People interpret situations differently and perform in ways that make sense to them. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about why did it make sense for that person to do what they did in the way that they did it. And it has to do with how they perceived that situation in that moment. We have an extremely natural tendency to seek out patterns and predictability in our environment. It helps us make sense of the world. It also gives us a sense of cognitive closure that is really important for us to continue about our work. So based on a person's perceptions of their environment or their situation, and in addition to drawing on their implicit knowledge that they've gained over time through experience, through education, through their environment, a conscious decision will be made. Now, just because a decision was conscious does not mean that the individual made that decision with the benefit of being all-knowing or omnipotent or with a reasonable amount of time to process every bit of information that was coming to them, right? We have to remember the constraints and limitations of a person, as well as what their perceptions were of a situation in any given time. That's going to inform us of why it made sense for them to do what they did in the way that they did it. So people generally go to work with the intention of doing their job, doing it well, and returning home the way that they arrived, healthy, stable, etc. So if an error is made, we can't simply assign blame. We can't simply assume that that was an intentional act or that it was someone's inability to do their job and do their job well. We have to consider or understand how the person interpreted their situation, given their limitations and capabilities, based on what they were able to perceive in a limited amount of time, also considering the implicit knowledge that they have, and then move forward from there. And we'll generally find that a decision was made in a moment in time because it made sense to that person. And we need to kind of assume that going into these conversations. Principle number 3, people adapt to meet the demands of complex and dynamic work environments. We already reviewed some key characteristics of complex systems. And so what makes our systems resilient is the ability of people to adapt. Rules and procedures and tasks and equipment often work extremely well with the limited of variability of variables that are considered. However, with complexity involved, not everything can be predicted or controlled. So we have to afford ourselves the space and the latitude for people to feel safe and comfortable to exercise their own adaptation to a situation. Our work is largely requires us to adapt to and depend on other people who are also unpredictable. The example ICAO uses is a quick turnaround. So if you need to execute on a quick turnaround where everyone from the crew to ground handlers and even schedulers and dispatchers are involved, we can see the need for adaptivity in those types of situations. ICAO states that while standards and procedures support a safe and efficient operation, people may need to adjust their work in a way that takes into account potential risk and manages unexpected or unanticipated events. So in this regard, we need to actively review rules and guidance to ensure that they meet the demands of complex systems. Principle number 4, people assess risk and make trade-offs. Pretty much every task we set out to complete has a purpose or a goal. And for these tasks, we are constantly weighing objectives to reach those goals. Their objectives may be safety-oriented, they may be efficiency-oriented, they may be cost-oriented. It's natural in our line of work to accept that the balancing of these objectives or goals can be difficult and trade-offs often need to be made. So think of things like efficiency versus thoroughness, or speed versus accuracy, cost benefit, short-term, long-term benefits, personal versus organizational goals. Whether or not we're aware of it in the moment, we are constantly assessing risk associated with our tasks and accepting a level of risk that will still allow us to achieve our objectives, hopefully. Another way to look at this is through the lens of incentives and rewards. If it is a norm in your organization to wait to write up a maintenance task until it's more convenient, so let's say you're out of base and you want to wait to write something up until you're back in base to make sure that you can get home back to base, even though the rules might say you need to write that item up immediately, right? I've seen this happen before. And the crew might experience that goal conflict where there is this pressure for them to perform in a way that is more efficient for the organization, even if it goes against what guidelines require or suggest. So they're incentivized to deviate. Then how can we predict or expect them to behave in other ways in other scenarios? We're setting this norm that deviance is okay if you need to, based on how you're weighing your goal conflicts. So let's talk more about deviations for just a quick moment. A trade-off may lead to a deviation, we know this, which may have a negative connotation. However, ICAO does state that procedures and rules are often prescribed in a limited context or for specific purposes, and it is the responsibility of people in the system to balance the risk and to find the right trade-off. People never intend to deviate, but they do intend to resolve goal conflicts within reasonable and acceptable risk limits. What's important to note here is that everyone's goals are different. We need to be mindful of that when trying to understand why things happen in the way that they did. Principle number 5, people's performance is influenced by working with people, technology, and the environment. So we operate in a socio-technical environment. our understanding of our operational environment is largely influenced by people and technical elements like equipment, tools, software, etc., also by our surroundings. However, these influences not only vary from one person to the next, but they vary moment to moment. And naturally, as people, we're constantly changing our understanding of our operational environment to keep up with these fluctuations. First, this is why it's important for us to recognize that people's perceptions vary, and we need to consider what those perceptions are when trying to understand why they completed something in the way that they did. So, for example, a well-designed tool makes our work a lot easier and may positively affect our outcome or our behavior, whereas the inverse may be true. We also function within groups, and one person may be a part of many different types of groups. At any given time, that person may have a reliance on other groups. However, each of those groups is operating under their own goals and their own constraints, and those may be misaligned with what that person's individual's goals are. Think about the dynamic between maintenance and pilots, for example. We know that the common goal might be the same, but there are differences in the immediate goals that people are trying to achieve, right? So the short-term goals and the pressures that are created from those goals affect the relationships and the dynamics of these individuals and their perceptions and the way that they might go about their work. I don't know about you, but these principles do make quite a bit of sense to me. And if you can have a conversation around them or allude to them in your conversations, then we can start to break down this psychological safety wall or that's been created and build towards a more resilient system. Now, I know we're coming up on time here, so I want to end with this last little visual about margin because I think it's really important here. All of these principles lend themselves to creating margin in our system. And this concept of margin allows us to visualize the space that we operate in. So on this chart, we have a black line, which is our work as planned, and then our blue line, which is work as performed. So it's how we perform our work according to how we've planned our work. We are never going to perform it exactly the way that it's been planned. It's imperfect, if you will. This red line is an ever-existing random potential for a negative outcome or for a bad outcome. And when our work as performed dips in a way that intersects with that bad outcome line, we can have potentially a bad outcome. But what is more important here is this green space. This green space is what we call operational margin. It essentially takes all of the pressures, all of people's capabilities and limitations, and considerations of human performance, and it says, hey, here's what's going on in the environment. Here's how much room you have to act based on your limitations, based on your perceptions, based on how you understand your environment. And here's the room for error or the space for adaptation. And you can operate within these bounds, but when you operate outside of them, now you're accepting an unreasonable amount of risk. So depending on our capacity as it relates to human performance, and depending on our propensity to take risk, our margin may increase or decrease. So for example, your operational margin as a fifth-year captain in a fleet that you've been flying for the last 10 years might be far greater than the operational margin of someone who's just now sitting in the cockpit, right? That's fairly straightforward. Now, mind you, experience and knowledge only account for a fraction of those influences upon us. So we have to think beyond that experience, and we can't become too comfortable in that regard, because we need to be able to understand that unpredictable scenarios do happen, and that's what this operational margin affords us the ability to account for. And it does so in this space where we don't need to be necessarily concerned about repercussions, because we're being afforded the ability to make decisions for situations where rules and guidelines aren't helpful, and we need to exercise our own creativity and our own adaptation and stray from typically accepted norms. So with that being said, I am going to end here. There's much more that we can say on this topic. I'm going to put up on the screen here a couple of different guides that can be useful when you're trying to incorporate human performance concepts into your daily activities. A very straightforward early approach that you can take is just start by absorbing these principles and having conversations around them. They don't need to be outward, but you can start to inject or infuse your language that you use with your counterparts and with your employees that starts to indicate to you that you care more about what their perceptions are and what limitations they're experiencing and these other human performance factors, not just about what the outcome of any given event was. So with that, we have a minute or two here to open it up for conversation and answer any questions that may have come up. Catherine, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Madeline. I'm hoping you feel better, that you powered through, though. That was great. A couple of people did just post their answer to your question about words, and some of them for perception. Some came up with teacher, safety compliance, perception from others was overreactor, and then my perception was schedule protector through the protecting of crew, aircraft, and passengers. So maybe you just want to chat about that for a moment, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're in a safety role or if you're not, obviously it's not just about executing on SMS requirements and understanding what safety is, right? It requires us to be, in a sense, social experts. And so I appreciate people's candor and bringing forth those phrases and words that you use to describe being a good executor of SMS is, like I said, it's not just about understanding the requirements, but it's about understanding the social component and the human component to this. We need to be able to have conversations, to be aware of these elements of human performance, to be able to communicate them effectively, not only so that we can show people that we appreciate and understand the variability of people and why people make decisions and show them we understand that decision making, but also so that we can create this environment of psychological safety that allows them to feel trusted and heard and understood and willing to communicate what their experiences and their perceptions are back to us. It can be very scary or concerning for someone to outwardly or come forward very willingly to just openly talk about how they perceived a situation, because that might not be what is expected of them. And that can cause concern, right, for a lot of different reasons. So when we can start to communicate to them, when we can be these social experts that I'm talking about, that can start to open up these funnels that allow for information to flow back to us in a way that then we can make sense of and actually make changes that are more meaningful, that aren't just around putting more rules and structure in place, but they're actually about looking at our rules and structure and putting in language that allows us to create this margin, that allows people to operate and feel comfortable operating and making decisions based on their own experiences and their own ability to adapt based on all these collective influences upon them.
Awesome. Thank you, Madeline. And thank you all for attending. Everyone who was here live today will get CAM credit through NBAA. I put the links for the next two safety sessions in the chat, so hope you can register for that. The next one will be on Thursday, November 2nd, discussing effective GRAT, all of those risk assessments methodologies to reduce risk. Hope to see you there. Thank you so much, Madeline and Polaris Aero, and we'll see you all soon.